Alright guys, today we're going to look at completing the square. And we've looked at this a little bit in some other notes, but we're going to look at solving equations with completing the square. Alright, so this can only be done when you have a leading coefficient of 1. Alright, so we're going to look at what you do if you have a coefficient other than 1. But you can only complete the square if you have a leading coefficient of 1. Alright, to make the expression x squared plus ab a perfect square trinomial, add the term half of b squared to get x squared plus bx plus b over 2 squared. So we're going to half b and square it to get this term. When completing the square, make sure to add the same number to both sides of the equation. Alright. Don't forget the plus minus sign when taking the square root. That's also important because sometimes students forget that. Alright, so let's look at what this actually means. Alright, so find the value that completes the square, then rewrite it as a perfect square. Alright, so what we're trying to do is make this a perfect square trinomial so that we can rewrite it in factored form. Alright, so do that. It said to take the b, which is your middle term, so we've got ax squared plus bx plus c. So what we're doing is trying to find c to make this a perfect square trinomial. So b is always your middle term. So b in this case is negative 36. So we're going to take negative 36, we're going to half it, and then we're going to square it. So if you half negative 36, you get negative 18. And if you square negative 18, you get 324. So 324 is what goes here. So we're going to take the middle term, our b term, we're going to half it and then square it. Okay? So we're going to do the same thing over here. So if we take this and we half it, so we're going to have 7. We're going to half it, and we're going to square it. Since this does not divide evenly, we're just going to square the numerator and the denominator. So this is going to be 49 over 4. All right, so it says find the value that completes the square and rewrite as a perfect square. All right, so once I complete the square, this is now a perfect square trinomial. That means I can write it as a binomial squared. So this is a squared, and this is, so if you remember perfect square trinomial, it's a squared. In this case, it's negative, so negative 2ab plus b squared. So this number is squared, and this number is squared. So whatever those numbers are before you square them is what goes here. So x goes here. And to get 324, we took negative 18 and squared it. So this is going to be negative 18. All right, so over here, again, we're using this same form, except now it's a plus in the middle. But we still know that both the end terms are perfect squares. So I'm going to have p, and I'm going to have 7 halves. And this time, because it's a plus, my binomial is positive there. All right, so that's how you complete the square and then write it as a perfect square trinomial, or write it in factored form. All right, to solve an equation by completing the square. All right, there's a couple different ways you can do this, and I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest way. So we're going to have x squared minus 16x plus blank. I'm going to move this to the other side, so I'm going to have negative 2, and when I move it over, I'm subtracting negative 61 to the other side. But then I'm going to do plus blank. All right, when you're solving an equation, whatever you do to one side of the equation, you have to do to the other side. So I put this here, so when I go back to half this and square it, I don't forget to add it to both sides. Okay, so I'm going to do the same process we did in the first two examples. I'm going to do negative 16. I'm going to half it, and then I'm going to square it. So negative 16 over 2 is negative 8. When I square that, I get 64. So I'm going to add 64 to both sides of my equation. Now I can rewrite this in factored form or as a perfect square trinomial. And I can combine these. So -2 and -61 is -63 plus 64 is 1. All right, from here it's easy to solve. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Remember the little note, when you take the square root, make sure you do plus or minus. So I'm going to have x minus 8. The squared cancels the square root. So it's going to leave plus or minus. The square root of 1 is just 1. So I'm going to have x minus 8 equals 1 and x minus 8 equals -1. This gives me my two answers. If you forget your plus or minus, you're going to be missing one of your solutions. So I'm going to add 8. X equals 9. Add 8. X equals 7. So to solve this equation by completing the square, I'm going to get 7 and 9 as my solutions. You can put x equals 7, x equals 9, or you can write them as a solution set. All right, let's look at another example. We're going to do it the same way. So we're going to have n squared plus 10n plus blank equals -7. I'm going to add the 103 to the other side. And whatever I add here when I complete the square, to make sure my equation stays the same, I'm going to add it to the other side too. All right, now I'm going to take my middle term, 10. I'm going to half it. It's a poor set of parentheses. Sometimes my pen doesn't work the way I want it to. It doesn't like for me to go too fast. So I'm going to take 10, half it, and square it. Half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. So I know that I'm going to put 25 here. And to make sure it stays equal, I'm going to put 25 on the other side. Now that this is a perfect square trinomial, I can rewrite this as n plus 5 squared equals -7 plus 103 plus 25 gives me 121. All right, look at that, perfect square. Isn't that nice? All right, now we take the square root of both sides. So we've got n plus 5 equals, don't forget your plus or minus, and then the square root of 121 is 11. 11 squared is 121. All right, again, we're going to do n plus 5 equals 11. N plus 5 equals -11. Subtract n equals 6 and n equals -16. So again, you can write it as a solution set. We normally put the negatives, or we put them in order from least to greatest. So we'll put the negative first, or you can simply write it as -16 and 6. So again, either way you want to write that is fine. All right. I think we have one more example. Remember, the very first page said you can only use completing the square if the leading coefficient is a 1. So since this is a 10, we have one additional step. So the additional step is divide the whole equation by 10. All right, that gets rid of the leading coefficient. Once the leading coefficient is a 1, then we can complete the square. So 20 divided by 10 is 2x. This is just 53 over 10. And I'm just going to leave this as -7 over 10. All right, same process after that. X squared plus 2x plus blank equals -7 over 10. I'm going to subtract this to the other side, so minus 53 over 10, and then plus blank. So whatever I add here, I have to add here as well. All right, take 2, half it, and then square it. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. Now, when you add fractions, you have to have a common denominator. So what's equivalent to 1 that has a denominator of 10? That's just 10 over 10. All right, so this is a perfect square trinomial, so now I can write it as a perfect square trinomial or in factored form. And then I've got -7 and -53 is -60. -60 plus 10 is -50. And -50 divided by 10 is just -5. All right, now I'll take the square root. Remember, when you take the square root, you've got a plus or minus. So I'm going to have x plus 1 equals plus or minus. Now, since I have a negative under the square root, I bring out the I. And then, because this is a radical and it's not going to simplify any further, we can leave this as plus or minus and just subtract 1. So x equals -1 plus or minus I square roots of 5. And that's going to be your solution. So it's going to be x equals -1 plus or minus I square roots of 5. And again, that represents -1 plus I square roots of 5 and -1 minus I square roots of 5. So that's still two solutions, but that's how you use completing the square. So as long as you have good number sense, this will not be very difficult, but it is important to know that when you take the square root of a negative, you're going to get an imaginary part. It's also important to know that you have to divide by this 10 first. Just all these little rules that you have to remember. If you have those written in your notes, that'll be very helpful. If you have any questions about completing the square, please let me know.